Welcome to the 6th Denius Symposium for News Integrity here in the Moody College of Communication at the University of Texas in Austin. This annual event is made possible because of generous funding from the Denius family and the Kane Family Foundation. This event is also a partnership between the Annette Strauss Institute for Civic Life and the School of Journalism and Media, our new name. This event usually takes place in the fall, but a lot of things were going on then. We're happy to host it this spring. And this spring, we can explore the topic of time and time pressure, especially in political and election news reporting. You know, what's so, crucial about this event is that it takes us away from just thinking about what news is produced and thinking about how news is produced. And this panel, this symposium, is a moment of reflection, of thinking about what journalism is. We're pleased to have today's panel, and we'll introduce them later. And what's great about them is that this isn't just a panel of people who were producing journalism back in the last century, but people who are doing journalism now. And they can tell us about today's pressures as opposed to those that were happening in the 80s and the 90s and even the aughts. I am so thrilled to introduce our moderator, Professor Sharon Jarvis. She is an associate professor in communication studies here in Moody College, and she's associate director of the Annette Strauss Institute. Not only is she a top researcher, she's also won practically every teaching award here at the university. In fact, she is officially a university distinguished teaching professor. I am so proud to turn this over to Dr. Jarvis and to our wonderful dynamic.
Thank you so much, Professor McElroy. Hello, everyone. Delighted that you all could make it and be with us today. As was mentioned, our topic addresses temporal pressures in the news as it relates to general reporting, 24-hour news, and Twitter. And I'm absolutely delighted to introduce our panelists. And we were very intensive as we selected them. At the Strauss Institute, where I've worked for the past 20 years, we firmly believe that role models teach us how far we can go. And these four individuals are UT full Longhorn role models. And their bios are posted in the chat. Yet, if I may, I'll just briefly touch on some of their accomplishments in alphabetical order, and then we'll shift to about 40 minutes of questions. If you have questions, please put them in the chat. And we have colleagues at the Strauss Institute who in about 45 minutes will open those up for discussion for all of us. So turning to our colleagues, role models, students who once were in your seats, we will first turn to Luqman Adeniyi, and I'll ask him to unmute, I'll ask folks to unmute when I mention their names. While he was sitting in your seat at UT, he ran Texas Student Television. He worked at the Texas Tribune. He had an internship with AP and with KXAN. After graduating UT, he went on to CNBC and CNN, and he's currently working on his master's degree at Georgetown. Our second colleague in alphabetical order is Dr. Joe Cutbirth, who's currently on the faculty at Moody College, but just like you, he is a Longhorn, lifelong, big football fan, for those of you who have a similar affinity. He has years of experience in political life and in writing, reporting and editing. He went on to get a PhD from Columbia. And again, we're thrilled that he's here at UT on our faculty. In alphabetical order, again, third, we have Abby Livingston, who is the lead reporter in Washington, D.C. for the Texas Tribune, where she won a 2017 National Press Club Award for reporting. Prior to that, she worked for CNN and NBC, and she is an incredible softball player, should that come up. Finally, it's a delight to introduce Allyson Waller. She's currently at the New York Times, where she has experience covering the coronavirus pandemic and the 2020 campaign. Prior to working at the New York Times, she has written for the Miami Herald and the Texas Tribune. So I'm delighted that you all are with us. Again, for our colleagues who are Zooming in, please keep an eye on the chat. If you would like to raise questions, we can get to those in about 40 minutes. And so for most of the Q&A today, we will just flow and the panelists can jump in. In this one instance, we will go in this order, Dr. Cutbirth, then Abby, then Luqman, then Allyson. But here's our opening question. When you first started in your careers, how were you taught to think about the role of time in reporting? What did your teachers or mentors tell you? And how did that instruction inform how you approached your jobs?
Thank you, Sharon. It's really nice to be here with everyone. So I guess I'm the bad old days avatar here, but because my first jobs in journalism were back in the 1980s, and so that was no internet, or at least no internet that we used, and very much the old no 24-hour news cycle. The TV reporters had their cycles, the newspaper reporters had their cycles. My first job was in a paper where I had a morning edition and an afternoon edition, and it was very clear. The phrase would be, "Deadlines are sacrosanct." So there was just no excuse to not make your deadline. I was thinking about this as I was thinking about the panel. My old city editor had a sign back by his desk, and it said, "Better never than late." that was the mantra. Better never than late. And I was remembering, it would not be unusual in those days for me to be in the room typing on, trying to finish my story up right. It'd be 11 o'clock for the afternoon, and Carol, my city editor, would start just yelling across the newsroom. He'd say, "File, file, file, file," and he would just yell through the newsroom. He would say, "File your story now, Cutbirth, file, file. If you don't file now, I'm going to walk up there, I'm going to hit send." And he would just almost harass you on your deadline to get that thing sent. And it was not above his actual way of leading the newsroom to get up and walk up to a reporter's desk and just say, "Scoot over," and he just hit file on the keyboard. And so that was really what deadlines were about in those days. Later, when I was editor at the Texas Observer, that was not my style, but that was very much the style back in the 80s when I started.
Fantastic. And before we go to Abby, I did see Robert Quigley in the chat, who is the professor for this class, share that he might have been that kind of editor. Wonderful input, Professor Quigley. To Abby.
I think one of the most formative moments for me was when I was a desk assistant in the NBC News Washington Bureau. And there was a court case. I think it was maybe Scooter Libby or something. And NBC had set up a almost military specific operation to get the verdict out because cameras were not allowed in the courthouse. And so it was a relaying of information. And from the newsroom, we had all of our competitors on the screens, and we got the verdict up first, and the whole newsroom started cheering. And so it was a really formative moment for the breaking nature of television news. But what I think is fascinating is I think there's an argument to be made. We're almost going in the opposite direction. Maybe about 5 years ago, there was another court ruling that Justice John Roberts basically spent the entire opinion saying why it should go one way. And then almost in the last sentence, he went the opposite direction. And the producers at one of the networks didn't read to the last word. And so in one network reported it wrong. And I think we're hitting a point, particularly in the Trump era, where that urgency of being first is no longer, there have been so many mishaps, people getting things wrong, that I do think that there's more power in a reporter saying, "Wait, I don't have this." Or, even when your competitors are filing the story, I don't have this. And editors are much more, "Okay, when you get it, we feel good about this." And so I think that's an interesting that the technology had almost gotten so ahead of ourselves that they were creating really egregious errors that would not have happened if not for that pressure. So I that's kind of the deadline pressure was very intense when I was in a newspaper called Roll Call. And it's just like Joe said, economics of it forced you to turn your story in on time because there were literal presses that needed a certain amount of time to print the paper. Now it seems it's just pretty much whenever you can get it filed, and the reporter puts the pressure on themselves because everybody else is filing the same story too.
Wonderful. And Luqman?
Yeah, so I definitely came up in the time with Twitter, with social media already being an ingrained part of the newsroom and being a major part of how journalists were reporting and thinking about things. So really with time, it was more about getting things right and making sure that we're putting out the correct information. So the timing took a little bit of a step back. We were still trying to make sure we get things out quickly and get things out while they're it's relevant, while it's hot. But it was making sure that we have the information correct, and even sometimes thorough, going 2-3 steps. That's how it was told to me, in my classes at UT Austin with Professor Quigley and all of the other professors there. And then same thing when I started working at CNBC and at CNN. We started to take more of that. Okay, we have that big audience and we have that responsibility to make sure that we get the information out correctly. So we need to take that time to be able to step back and report things as we need to.
A quick follow-up to Luqman. You mentioned CNBC and you also mentioned CNN. Were there differences with the temporal pressures across those two channels, given the topic?
Yeah. I think, with CNBC, it's a lot more about stocks and business and earnings report and those different types of things. So whenever it was, we had those numbers, as soon as they come out, it was you need to get them out quickly and let people understand what's happening, why are things moving, why is the stock moving, how's the market reacting. And so, time was of the essence, but again, it went through at least 2 different people before it was put out, out on social media or put out onto, on the screen whenever you have the rolling tickers and different things like that. And at CNN, part of my job too, as an associate producer there, was to work with social media and putting things out online. So it was having second eyes and having multiple people looking at it, or maybe a higher manager kind of giving you that okay before we push things for other people to see.
Yeah, fantastic, wonderful. Allyson?
Yes. So because I'm early in my career, it's still fresh in my brain, the things that I've learned at UT at the School of Journalism. So, from professors like Robert Quigley and Tracy Dolby, I think it's still fresh in my mind when I do reporting now on the breaking news desk for the Times that, time is of the essence, but what you want to make sure that you keep at the forefront of your mind is that you're reporting things that have been confirmed, that you don't have to guess on. It shouldn't compromise, the timing shouldn't compromise the integrity of your work or your reporting. And I pretty much have learned the same thing so far from my editors at the Times. We are a breaking news desk, but we want to make sure we're right on things. We just don't want to be fast for the sake of being fast. So sometimes that means getting 200 to 300 words up on a website, and it may not have all the ins and outs of what is happening, but this is what we know for sure and what we know to be true. And so that's just kind of the approach I take with my reporting, and when it comes to being timely, and to also being honest with readers, saying it's unclear as to what time of day this happened, or it's unclear as to the full breadth of how this arrest happened or something like that. Just being honest that, you did your due diligence to try to find out this information, but at the moment you don't have all the details. So I just think, to me personally, when it comes to timeliness and news reporting, it's always best to just prioritize reporting first off and getting firsthand confirmation when you can. Being first is great. And when you are, it's something I think to celebrate, but I think there's more comfort in knowing that you did, your due diligence.
I'll follow up with the same question that I asked to Luqman. So you've spent the past year focusing on COVID and then some on 2020. Did you feel a difference in time pressures on those 2 topics?
A little difference, I guess you would say. A lot of times more of my 2020 coverage for the desk I'm on had to do more with contextual things. So it was really the politics desk that was ahead of the breaking stuff related to that. I would say more with COVID, I personally felt more time pressures since I was working on the Times live briefing. And so, sometimes breaking news would happen, say a politician would contract COVID or be in contact with someone that had COVID, and we would try to report it and get it up fast. You definitely do feel those time pressures, especially during this time where everyone's looking at, this person is saying something about COVID, but then it turns out that now they have COVID. Did they like take the proper precautions that they needed to take, and all that kind of stuff? So personally, for me, I have felt more pressure on the COVID front, kind of since I focus on more of the contextual side of things related to politics. I kind of have more time to breathe. But yeah, I would say for me on the COVID front, I felt the time pressure a little bit more, just because the live briefing is something that's continually updated throughout the day. And you want to make sure, you're not stuck with kind of the same news on there throughout the 24-hour period.
Really nice. And then Zoom complicates crosstalk. But before we go to our next question on the tensions between print and television, does anyone have a comment on the other panelists' comments? Okay, terrific. Then we'll go to the next one. And several of you have experience, I believe all of you have experience in print reporting, and some of you have worked for these 24-hour news channels. We're speaking to a group of journalism students. What are the pressures that these two institutions put on each other with regard to time? So the way that we wrote it earlier, what is your take on the pressures that 24-hour news channels put on television and print news? Are they similar? Are they different?
I'll jump in. I think they're pretty similar. And I think in the evolution of my career, print has become more like television and television has become more like print. And you can see there's a lot of cross-pollination in the reportings. I think the bigger thing, and this is something that anybody who goes into a national newsroom is going to feel as a reporter, it's Twitter that has overwhelmed everything. And it's one of, and I mean, I don't feel this as much in my newsroom, but other reporters will. Say Politico gets a story and they tweet it out. Well, the cable news producers are going to bear down, or they're going to send all around that Politico's got this scoop. Well, say it's NBC, MSNBC, those reporters are working on it. And so it's just, I think it's hard to know what your organization has versus what the competition has. And then on top of it, just the most difficult thing in both places during breaking news is just the fog of war, where you don't understand what's happening. It's very confusing, and suddenly you're having to articulate it for other people. And so it just gets very, very confusing. And the harder thing about television, and one of the reasons I left, was not only do you have the actual information, but you've got to find the video. You've got to find the name for the chyron, the proper title. I mean, you still have to do that in print, but it is so much more fast paced, and it is just an absolute mad scramble. And that's why a good reporter, as much as they can, will know ahead of time if something's coming and be prepared, have a pre-write ready to go, or have that video roll of that person who you think might die, and that kind of thing. And so as much as you can be prepared, and part of that, I mean, that is a reporting skill in itself.
Yeah, wonderful. Other thoughts?
Yeah, I'd like to say, I'm not sure if President Trump actually knew Max McCombs, our colleague, but for anyone who doesn't know Max McCombs, he is the authority in media studies on a thing called agenda setting, right? And I think what Trump was so able to do so well, particularly his first campaign, was he would set the agenda in the morning with Twitter. And so what agenda setting says is, we won't tell you what to think, but we'll tell you what to think about. And Trump would tweet at 4 or 5 a.m. something, and by the time the 6 a.m. cable news shows were talking about his tweet, it didn't matter what Jeb Bush had at 9:15 on his 12-point education program. The whole news cycle for the day was set, and it was set in that agenda setting function that Twitter has. And I think more and more as news media, as print organizations have an online presence, as TV organizations have an online presence, online organizations have video presence, this thing is so meshed together that I think Twitter has really, as Abby said, it really has come in as the dominant agenda setting device in the narrative in many ways.
And I have to agree on that. I would definitely say the time pressures make journalists feel more plugged in. Like, speaking of Twitter, there's various accounts I have alerts on for like 24/7. So I'm still getting those alerts even when I'm technically like off the clock, because I just want to make sure I'm not missing anything, or say my desk is not missing anything, and that, we're either ahead of the competition, or, we're picking up where the competition is currently leading, or where the conversations are going. And so, yeah, I would definitely say, to me, I've only had experience personally in print and like mainly newsrooms that work online, but I would just say it does feel kind of conflating. I mean, just everyone is facing unique online pressures. So yeah.
Yeah, you really find news just breaking at any time and at any time of the day. And so that's really what, kind of makes people just kind of shift to, really focus on whatever is new and breaking. Just like Abby was saying, when Politico posts something, it's like, okay, there's a scoop, that's the new story. But then Trump can tweet something, and then somebody passes away, and then it's the next thing, and it's the next thing. So it's kind of, you always have to be on your toes and be ready to shift to find more information, get context, and even try to pull people back to understand, okay, wait, that happened last week, that happened a few days ago. It's still very important. These are the implications that are going to be affecting us as we move forward.
Yeah, fantastic. To connect to Luqman's notion about what's breaking versus what's important, let's go ahead and write an essay question for Dr. Quigley's class, right? Professor Quigley, here we go. From our panelists, how would the four of you advise your fellow Longhorns to report on tweets? How do you know if one's important? How do you know if it's a distraction? And if that's a bad question, fix it.
Someone else go first, feel free.
Go ahead.
And I stole this question from Dr. Cutbirth, by the way.
I'll jump in. Okay, so the first thing is sometimes a lawmaker, and that's my worldview, I cover the US Capitol, they will announce on Twitter, I am retiring. And that is news. Like there's going to be a race to replace them. There's going to be implications to their district, that kind of thing. Then there is probably 5 years ago, the practice has been really rooted out. People or news organizations would just take random tweets and write stories. Oh, so-and-so like this person on Twitter reacted to X. Well, since we've known now that Russians infiltrated Twitter, like that's not a really good idea. Like it's just like doing a man on the street interview. You've got to verify who these people are, their relevance. Just because something's on Twitter makes it news. I think one thing that is I'm kind of struggling with is in Washington 10 years ago, if you had a problem with someone, whether it was you're a lawmaker or whomever, you picked up the phone and called them and said, look, I don't like what you did today. And then you hash it out and no one was the wiser for the dispute. Now these are just open warfare on Twitter. And I think you just kind of have to use some critical thinking of like, who is my audience? How does this serve? Why are they fighting? And there's some people, I think with Twitter, one of the things that is, I will backtrack. So I had a conversation with my high school English teacher a couple of days ago, and she made a comment about how everyone in Washington is only there, or the politicians are only there for power and money. And I said, actually, no, you're dead wrong. They're there for fame. And so I think you have to think about, why are they doing this? And am I covering in a way that's going to incentivize them more bad behavior? And so it's a really, really hard calculation. And it's something you've got to discuss with your editors, because news is news. But other times there are politicians who are really inflammatory on purpose because that's what they live for. And that is their only reason to be in Congress. And so I'm not saying don't cover. I'm just saying you can't just automatically react, oh my gosh, news. So I hope that's helpful.
Thank you. And then the question again was, how do you know if a tweet, for our fellow Longhorns in this class, how do you know if a tweet merits attention in the news?
I would definitely say, I mean, if it's like, say an official or a government official giving like a response to breaking news, but like Abby said, like, if their response is in a sense like trying to be inflammatory or in any way doesn't like contribute to the actual discourse, I think you just have to use your news judgment and see like, does this like help my reader understand what's going on? There's definitely times like, a lot of times like this past year, I've been reporting a lot on police misconduct and like police brutality and things like that. And so, there are times, sometimes certain police departments, they'll make official statements on Twitter and things like that. And, in a sense, I may use those statements, but again, I will do my best to try to get someone on the phone so I can, get more out of them, out of those statements and things like that. So sometimes I think tweets can be a great starting point and a launching board to like further your reporting. But at the same time too, you want to go beyond just the tweet itself, especially if, the time permits.
One thing I like about Twitter is that people's names are attached to their tweets. And so it in general, there's not the off the record, I want to say this about somebody, but don't use my name for it. A lot of times it's out there and there's a little more accountability to it. But I would use that phrase that President Reagan coined famously, trust but verify. So someone offers something, an allegation. I think what Abby was talking about is true. So oftentimes just an inflammatory remark becomes a news story before it's checked out. And in that news cycle that happens. But I think what I would encourage people who are getting the business to do is verify. You've got to verify this stuff, because in the end, your name becomes attached to your reporting.
Yeah, it's all about getting that context and really going through and continuing your line of reporting. And I think also, calling the senator or the government official, calling them out and trying to see, okay, you said that you've said this type of thing, but it doesn't match what you said before, or this is a pattern where you're kind of just inciting folks. We want to ask, like, okay, is this your agenda? Like, is this what you're trying to do? Trying to get them to kind of just say it on the record that yes, I'm kind of trying to go. What are they trying to go for? If they're trying to go for a certain story, or trying to get for more information, then they need to be more transparent about what they're doing. And if they can't say that, then that it's kind of just noise that they're making. They're trying to be inflammatory, and you can kind of point that out for the readers and let them recognize what's being done to them and how they're being controlled, or trying to be led to think in a certain way.
Wonderful. A little bit of a follow-up on this notion. Both Allyson and Luqman have mentioned, and perhaps Abby and Joe as well, but building trust with the reader, being honest with the reader. And I'm curious if we could make this kind of concrete. Was there a journalism educator or an editor or a colleague who really helped you in that regard?
I'll jump in. Mine was Maureen Dowd, the New York Times columnist, and she was my literary idol, and I met her on a street, and she spent an hour kind of just early in my career just kind of talking to me. And there had been a controversy that week about a famous reporter had allowed someone to write in their name, and she just was she kept coming back to it. That's not okay. You can't do that. And she beat into my head that sense of honesty and being not being true to the reader, but also the other thing that's sort of a non sequitur, but just always share credit when you're working with someone. Never be the hog who, if they really did help you, share the byline. It doesn't hurt anybody. So but I would say it was Maureen Dowd.
Important on two fronts. Again, I introduced you all as role models. So Abby, you just walked up to her on the street.
Yes. It was daylight. She had her assistant, who is now the famous Washington Post reporter, Ashley Parker. It was not like I just came out of the bushes and said hi, but I just recognized her and said, I really enjoy your book. And she gave me her email address. And so, always be careful, be cautious, but that is one thing I've always tried to do, is really focus on my networking, but in a very serious way and sincere way. Not, you can see people who chase around famous people and are very disingenuous. So, and I will do anything for Maureen. So she's been wonderful to me.
Fantastic, wonderful. And then the question again, you've mentioned how to build honesty and trust with the reader. Any faculty, mentors, colleagues who helped you in that regard?
Well, I'll jump in and say, that city editor that I kind of vilified in my opening comments, he also, I always just wanted to be a political writer at the Texas Capitol. That's the only job I ever wanted to have, that I thought I would just die if I didn't get to do it. I was really blessed that I got to. But that city editor who taught me that first stuff, early in that career, he pulled me aside one day and he goes, I want to tell you something about this. You get your paycheck from Hart Hanks. That was the company that owned our paper at that point. You get your paycheck from Hart Hanks, but you work for the people in this community. Just don't ever forget that. You work for them, you don't work for hard hats. And he kind of helped me right size that a little bit about remembering that journalism's a little different in that way, that sometimes the people who write you your paycheck aren't really your primary focus, that you really work for the people who are in your communities. And that always helped me when I was thinking about what to write, because sometimes it helped me think, I need to give these people information. I don't need to be kicking sand in people's faces or doing that silliness or getting caught up in the moment. What can I do for the people that live in this community? And so that moment with Carol, don't forget you work for them, not the people who write the paycheck. I mean, it's a little metaphor.
It's great.
I would say for me, like what's coming to my mind are really like the editors that I worked with at the Texas Tribune and the Miami Herald. At the Texas Tribune, I was investigative fellow, and I was working on this series on on inequality in the state of Texas. And I remember my editor at the time, like Dave Harmon, really honed into me that the importance of just speaking to the everyday people on the ground. Of course, you want to get context from the politicians and the policymakers and, the people that, create legislation and things like that. But you really, really want to, explain for your readers how these legislations and policies play out through the everyday people that live through those things. So that always really did stick with me and made me want to always prioritize a lot of everyday people in my writing, especially as it relates to politics and policy. And then at the Miami Herald, I was working as a city and local government intern, and my editor there, Marjorie Lambert, and there was a reporter that I often worked closely with, Joey Fletches, who we reported on city and local government in Miami. And, he just, I really did admire how many sources he had within the community. When I would go with him for advice on the story, I mean, he just had a Rolodex of people to get in contact with. And I mean, he knew the politicians and the city officials well, but he also was attuned to just, advocates left and right, people and nonprofits and different organizations in different areas of the city. And so, those two experiences definitely inspired me to, want to make sure I have that Rolodex of sources and those people to get in touch with and things like that.
I would say for me, it was more Diana Dawson. I worked with her as, she was a professor, but I also worked with her as a writing coach. And so she really drilled in, details and asking questions and trying to do things to understand the story and get to the very core of it. And so trying to push people in my career, because I've worked more on on the reporting team or as a producer kind of in the background or, as a group within the newsroom. And so being able to challenge folks and try to get people to, go deeper, go to another level and ask those questions for understanding. And then if you have those questions and you have that in your reporting and you say, okay, wait, I read this story, I went through it, some things are kind of missing, the connection is not there. And so trying to really lay that out for the readers, that lets them know, okay, this is where we were coming. I mean, this is where we're going, this is where we're coming from. And so just learning those skills and trying to ask those questions is something that I learned from her.
Great, fantastic. The motto of the Annette Strauss Institute is that we'd love to create more informed voters and better citizens. So this next one is one of the #1 questions I get from undergrads, and I have for the past 20 years. Where do you get your political news?
I'll jump in. So obviously Twitter, and I'm sure y'all have heard this answer 1,000 times. Make sure your Twitter diet is balanced and you're seeing it from all sectors. Clearly, I'll check. My homepage is set to the New York Times. Those are the obvious answers. One thing I will stress that has just become really apparent to me in the last 5 years. I have to consciously turn off Twitter, and I think for your mental health you have to, because it is not normal life, and I really had to consciously think about reading books, like actual hardcover books, and understanding history, understanding why we got to a certain point. I've been reading a lot about the Soviet Union just because Putin, Navalny, all of that is going on. And so I do think you can consume too much news. You will never read everything. When I first got to Washington, there was a finite of material that you were expected to read every day before the day got going. That is impossible now. And this is something also to pass on from Maureen's conversation with me. Have an awareness of culture. Understand what movies are out there and what music, because it is so easy to burrow down into your worldview or what you cover that you lose all sense of perspective of what average Americans are interested and want to know about. And so I think it's obvious the New York Times, the Washington Post are going to set a lot of the agenda, but you have got to have peripheral vision and have contextual knowledge of how we got to wherever we are.
Yeah, I think that's of importance too, like at the emphasis on, like taking in culture beyond just politics and things like that. So example for me, like of course, I'm really attuned, to Black culture. I grew up in a Black household, of course. So I'm going to consume like those mediums that focus on Black culture. So I'm going to, consume the essence, sometimes, the root, all those kind of things. And, Black culture a lot of times coincides with politics. And so it brings me more of a unique perspective on, politics, on legislation, on certain politicians and things like that, aside from consuming the traditional outlets like the New York Times and the Washington Post and things like that. But I also, I have learned too that there's great ways to consume, political journalism and just journalism in general, of course, beyond just print and TV. There's podcasts, there's newsletters, there's various ways, if you're busy and things like that, that you can consume in a 10-minute time frame. Things just beyond Twitter to give a more nuanced view of news and things like that.
Yeah, so I was going to say NPR is something that I've listened to a lot, and then going through podcasts, and I think social media, sort of to what Allyson was saying, and Abby too, like if you are looking at some of these subject matter experts, people who are talking about different things that you don't usually get exposed to, like go through your Twitter list and who you're following. Are you following Native American people who have, those who are maybe professors in that type of in the culture, or people? Do you have a lot of Black women on your news feed? Who are the type of people that you're interacting with? And you have to think of like, what spaces do I not get a lot of information from? So that's one thing that I've used to see, like, okay, somebody's raising the alarm about the protests in India. Somebody's raising an alarm about, the NSARS protests that happened in Nigeria. And so you're trying to think of like, on a worldly scale, also not just political in the US. You want to kind of get the news from all these different type of perspectives and standpoints. So for me, it's Twitter, it's listening to NPR because they go into, more of the details and, may have a longer story where they invite a reporter on, they just have that conversation. So all those different things have really helped to, broaden my political news diet and understand different things that are happening.
Terrific. Thank you, Joe.
Yeah, NPR is a really good, a real frequent one for me. But again, I want to borrow something from Abby that I think was really important. I like to read too. And about 3 years ago, I cut my cable TV off. I just don't watch any cable news. And I just you talk about a vast wasteland. And it just really was something that and as I was doing it, I actually had these like second thoughts, like, can I really do this? But I don't subscribe. I don't watch MSNBC, CNN, Fox. I don't watch that chatter. But I do like to read. And so I can get most of that through my internet. But Isabel Wilkerson has this great book recently called Cast. That was just a phenomenal, I think, example of maybe what Abby was talking about understanding your world in a different way. And so I've moved over to that kind of stuff as well. I get a lot of stuff in my social network because I'm in front of a computer all the time. But I've moved away from cable TV to the point that it's not even relevant for me.
Thank you all for your honesty. I'm excited to see we have a lot of activity in the chat. I believe that we have a Strauss colleague who might help forward some of those questions to us.
Absolutely. Yes, you do, Dr. Jarvis. Good afternoon or good morning, everyone. I have a few questions touching on the same subject between Hannah Wilford and Erica Sykes. Folks are asking about sources. And I'll ask Hannah's question to the entire panel. What have you found to be the best way to find on-the-ground sources, especially when a story centers around sensitive topics? And that's to the entire panel.
Personally, through like this day and age and during the pandemic, when you're not always on the ground and physically in person. For a lot of things, I have relied on social media, and especially Twitter, for crowdsourcing. But again, in a sense where I'm not going to pull someone's tweet and just use it. I'm going to, DM them, I'm going to message them. Or when I get in touch with like people that are leaders in nonprofit organizations, I ask a lot of times, do you know, are there people that come to you guys for help that I could speak to, or that that I could talk to, and things like that. So those have been lately a lot of times my two main ways for getting like the everyday type sources, the people that aren't but like super high officials or like politicians.
I'll jump in. I think one of the most important things, so obviously I live in Washington and it's very status driven. And when we don't have a pandemic and we're at the Capitol, you will see hundreds of reporters just swarm around people in leadership. And it's sometimes forgotten that other people are in the room when stuff happens. And I think it's important to, I will use my mother's advice, to be nice to everybody. Because I'm not saying that from like a journalistic go easy on them, but be aware that it's not just the most powerful people who are worth talking to. There are rank and file members all over the Capitol who I talk to. Most are not from Texas, and they have interesting insight. I have used my dad's childhood best friend as a source. And so I think it's a point of extroversion, and it's part of the social life of Washington. When we have social lives, is you go out to parties and you see people and you meet people, and you might think of them down the road, oh, I'll call that person. And so if you're an introvert, it's hard, but getting out there, introducing yourself when you're on a campaign swing, covering a campaign, walking up to a stranger, saying who you are and getting their feedback. And so it's having to get past a lot of shyness is difficult, but it gets easier as you go along.
Yeah, I was gonna say, you gotta take those, days, maybe, one day a month or something. I mean, of course, now with everything, well, with a lot that was going on in the past, it was kind of hard to be able to take, those, administrative days or and whatnot. But if you take those time to be able to go to different places, meet different people, that's really important. And then I think even within COVID, a lot of these panels happen. A lot of government meetings are happening in webinar form or online. So you can use that as a way to find sources of people who are going through these problems, who are actually talking about them and trying to find out what's going on or getting more information. So those are going to be great sources to be able to use that are not always accessible to you. So there's even a little bit more access that happens with COVID. If you're trying to look for panels and webinars and different group meetings that are happening, maybe introduce yourself as a journalist if you're going to take anything from that meeting, or you could just wait till the end and try to reach out to one or two of the people or put your information in the chat or something.
Thank you all very much. That was brilliant answers. And I have another question that's touches on something Dr. Cutbirth brought up earlier in the conversation from Mr. Walford Denius. As a journalist, and this is to the entire panel, how disturbing is it to you that Twitter sets the agenda? Do you feel manipulated, and can it be changed? And if so, how?
I think it does to an extent. I think you have to, as a reporter, maintain discipline on what you want to get done. So if there is breaking news, you've got to react and you've got to get the story up. Do it as quickly as possible. But there are quiet times. And during those quiet times, be disciplined about working on a story. And the Tribune's given me a lot of space to do entrepreneurial stories that have nothing to do with breaking news. And those are that's where I get my real joy from work and digging in deep. And yeah, so I think it's a matter of discipline, unless you're on like the breaking news beat. But, I think Trump just reset everything and we had to learn a new metabolism and when to weigh in and when not to. And now we're in a new readjustment with Joe Biden. Like I still kind of feel on edge, like what's going to happen next. And he's a much more routine politician.
Yeah, I think the point about doing more enterprise reporting is really important because whenever, new information, like whenever the tax story with President Trump, whenever that came out by the New York Times, there are other stories that are happening. So it was like the story for the night and maybe the morning. And then after that, it kind of just washed away. But that was an enterprise story that people weren't expecting necessarily at that time, but it's still relevant. It's very important. It's something that we all need to know. So like, it can be hard, and I think yes, Twitter does sometimes manipulate the news cycle. But if we have more newsrooms have that dedication to go and let their reporters do more of that entrepreneurial reporting or enterprise reporting, they're going to get more stories where we're going to start conversations on new things and have more features where people are going to start thinking about new topics and be able to explore those and kind of have a news cycle where we're discussing those type of things.
Well, so, sometimes I think it has to do with kind of the culture of your organization, and also maybe with your relationship with your editors and stuff. Because sometimes there's kind of a duality where editors will tell a reporter, particularly if they're in a bureau or someplace, maybe I don't know if this has ever been Abby's experience, but when you're in Washington D.C., but you're writing largely for a Texas audience. When I worked in the Capitol, I was writing for people in Fort Worth. The editors would always say, we want you to do different stuff. We want you to do different stuff. We can get that stuff off the wire. We want you to do different stuff, until something big happened. And then they're like, why aren't you covering this? Why aren't you covering this? Why aren't you covering what everybody else is covering? So sometimes there's this real kind of back and forth that sometimes your editors are kind of, they want their staff byline on the big stories, but they want you also not covering the big stories, covering something else. So I think there's a lot of internal communication and culture of the actual organization. You just need to keep on top of that. I think you need to have a good understanding with your editor, like, you know what, I'm going to step away from this. We're going to be okay because I'm going to go over here and do this. And that internal communication, I think, really can go a long way in freeing you up from just Twitter can be like sometimes like a piece of paper, like, gets out of your stack and starts blowing down the street. If you don't catch it right then, you spend blocks and blocks and blocks looking stupid and awkward and trying to catch up and get on the other side of the story. You never actually catch the piece of paper. So if you don't get something right in the moment, sometimes you either need to let it go completely or you need to move on.
I'll jump in with an example. The day the Capitol was attacked, social media was absolutely exploding with video and images, and everyone in the newsroom was trying to help me by sending them to me. And I finally I hit a point where I told my editor, I'm like, somebody else needs to do this. And so two of my colleagues, Alex Samuels and Patrick Svitek, handled the stuff that was coming online and did that story. And I was able to get on the phone, and I was literally talking to members in hiding and staffers. And so it's sort of being strategic in how you delegate your resources. I can get a hold of these people. They're very quick on the turn on writing. And so, but generally my workflow is I have one enterprise story I'm working on, and I work on it until I finish it, but I will drop it on a moment's notice for a daily story or a breaking news story. So that's kind of my workflow.
And I would say I have the same pretty much workflow when it comes to the breaking news desk at the Times. And it too, our desk, we are very heavy tuned into various social channels, whether it be Twitter or Facebook, or say sometimes Reddit too as well. So I think it can just depend on how some of the other panelists were saying on your editor and things like that. But I also, I try to take the time to, not focus so much on things that are trending on Twitter or things that, are taking the top 5 spots and things like that. Because I know that's not things that, everyone is interested in. Twitter is not a direct, comparison of the whole world. So I do think it's important to, yes, find that balance and, make sure that you are taking time to see what people are talking about on social media, but you're also trying to take the time to come up with those enterprise stories that, that you are personally interested in, or things that you probably have heard in an interview that, a reader is interested in, but doesn't see being covered anywhere else.
Well, I think that's advice we can all take for every ounce of our life. Try not to focus so much on Twitter. Heather Stewart asked the first question of the event to all panelists. And y'all touched on this when you were discussing folks who had an impact on your career. But this question is in the same vein, but touches on another concept. She asks, what was your process in finding your journalism niche? How do you know it's the right fit?
So I always knew I loved politics, and journalism was just sort of the outlet because I really didn't want to do campaigns. And so I sort of conformed my passion to journalism. And so that is a huge landscape even on that. And so one example is being open-minded. And I was at roll call on the politics desk, which means campaigns, and they were reshifting our beats. And everybody knows the Senate is cooler than the House. They call them Senate snobs. And the Senate is where everything happens. And a Senate race is like a mini presidential campaign. And obviously, I was going to cover the Senate, except that's not what my editor agreed to. So I got the House, and I was super grumpy. And and I ended up falling absolutely in love with the United States House of Representatives. It is the most chaotic, crazy mayhem place. It's like, once you understand it's a high school cafeteria, it all makes sense. And the members, you can get to them. They don't have so many staff around them. And it's like a very clear bias in my reporting. I write about the US House every time I can. And my editors sometimes have to be like, Abby, why don't we look at this from the Senate perspective? And so be open-minded, because you may not know what your specific passion is. And it could just sneak up on you and you're like, I didn't even know I could love that. And so that's my 2 cents.
I would say, I mean, I'm still like pretty early in my career, so I'm still trying to discover that passion and, you know, get the experiences to hopefully like realize that. I do definitely know I'm interested in covering politics, and also politics at like the intersection of race and things. But one thing that I have learned is, you know, talking to other reporters that are doing the coverage now that I'm very much interested in. So, I mean, it could be a person is into politics, but not journalism. But my recommendation would be, you know, talk to those people that you look up to and that you see that are, you know, in fields that you're interested in, even if you quite don't know if that's something that's going to turn into a passion yet.
Yeah, I'm definitely someone who's, you know, done a lot of different things in terms of what medium I've reported in, and then also, you know, I've done business and then politics professionally. You know, so like you just, like Abby was saying, you have to be willing just to try different things, and really, once you get there, put your all into it, and really connect with people who are in leadership roles, who are on your team, who you work with, and you'll really get a sense of what that feels like. And you know, as you continue to report and do different things, you're gonna figure out what you like. Even for me, my whole thing now has been more about leadership and management. And Joe, you know, talked about it earlier. About the culture of the newsroom. So that's why I've started to go back to school to study, and that's what's been important to me lately. So I think you have to be willing just to find different things and do different things.
In my era, the path was narrower. You tended to get out of school, go to what they call the B market, work locally for a while, and then hope you got a job at the morning news or the Houston Chronicle. And you kind of had to move up that way. And what I wanted to offer is, I think, you know, I spent about 5 years in my first job in Wichita Falls, Texas, which was my hometown. And so what you would do is you'd cover all the beats. You'd cover cops, you'd cover the school board, and you'd move around. And when it came time at one point for me to either go to City Hall or the courthouse, a person just kind of whispered in my ear and said, "You want to go to the courthouse because that's state government at the local level." I didn't know that really. I was like, "Okay, I'll go to the courthouse." And I think the about 2.5 years I spent covering the Wichita County Courthouse were some of the absolute best years of my entire career. And just learning those people, the justice of the peace and the district clerk and the county commissioners, and just watching that thing. We're kind of in the same way Abby kind of talked about the House of Representatives. It's a culture unto itself. But when I got down to Austin to do really the big work that I wanted to do, that experience, I ended up covering 2 big grand juries, one for the Speaker of the House and one for a U.S. Senator. And I could just see myself walking into the Travis County Courthouse, knowing exactly where to go. And my contemporaries who had gone over there because they were at UT and they got an internship at the Houston Chronicle and they just kind of stayed around, they didn't have a clue where to go when they went over to the courthouse because they had kind of come in from that direction. So I look back on that time as really just a really wonderful experience for me, and also a really learning experience.
So much, but I think we have time for one more question, despite the fact that there are so many wonderful questions that came in today. But one that keeps bubbling up and is a vein throughout the questions that were asked. I'll read Mr. Walter Denius's question, but it's in a few folks on a few folks' minds. Mr. Denius asks, in writing a story, how do you achieve objectability and set aside your own viewpoints, biases, prejudices? That's to the entire panel.
I'll answer that one, Waffy. um, you know, I love the Longhorns, right? I love the Longhorns. What if I got the assignment to write the Texas OU game, right? Could I go to the Cotton Bowl on October 12th and cover the Texas OU game without writing something like, the legendary Longhorns destroyed the evil empire from the north of the Red River, 17-16 today on a grand pass by. You know, I could do that. I can go to the Texas OU game and write a story that people would believe that I had given them an adequate and a good accounting of what was there. And when I talk to students about that, sometimes I talk to them about, you know, can you be in a conversation? Can you moderate your presence and your tone and things like that allow people to believe that you're there in good faith? And so I think that's one thing, one way I would look at it. Another is I would get away from that notion of objectivity and think more about broad scope, precision, and things like, can you cover something fully? And get all of the voices in there. I hate that two sides paradigm because I think most issues aren't two sides. I think they're more organic than that. But I think you want to step back. You want to ask yourself, can I do this? Is it the right story for me to do? Maybe there is a story that I couldn't do. But sometimes I think you want to be transparent about that and maybe look more for a broader idea, like scope, like precision, and things like that. I think help a little bit than getting in that two sides thing.
I could never write about the University of Oklahoma in an unbiased way, so I'll just put that out there. But in seriousness, I think it's just really important to be talking to as many people as possible, both in the process of the story and just in your daily, as you go about things, because it just, I think it's, there is an line that Aaron Sorkin has about screenwriting, and in every single scene, the character, he asks the question, what do they want? And so like, that's what I try to think about. What do they want? Why are they coming at it from this perspective? And then you put in the rest of the context. But I think it is so important, and of just not having confirmation bias, of only talking to people who say things that you agree with. But I also don't spend a lot of time thinking about my personal politics. Like I've gotten to the point where with like perhaps abortion, which everyone has an opinion on, when you're a political reporter, it really has political implications on where things go. And so I guess that's what I would say. It depends on their fundraising and things like that. So trying to think of the practical repercussions of what's happening.
Yeah, I was gonna say it matters too, like the kind of questions that you're asking. Are you asking, to learn from more information? Are you trying to get those viewpoints and understand? Or are you making judgment type of questions and just coming from a specific worldview or angle? Like you want to broaden out the angles that you're coming at topics with, and you really want to, try to understand where the other person is coming from and how they felt about things in the past. And really, and know yourself too. Maybe if you do have that, if you do have a political leaning or understanding that's, that might be a little different. Maybe you come from a different background. Maybe you, you just feel a certain way about this. You're supposed to have the editors who are going to go through your story and kind of ask those questions and challenge you and your thoughts. And then maybe you want to have somebody else read it in the newsroom that, okay, I know we butt head on this, or we've thought about this, or they might have a different take because they come from somewhere else. So you might let them look at it as well too.
And I agree too, like making sure that you know yourself, and to earlier what Joe was saying about making sure you have the, the full story, being more so that the focus than, being like, am I completely objective? I personally don't believe anyone's 100% objective. We all have opinions and biases. Like we are a product of, the place we grew up in and things like that. So I think focusing more on, are you getting the full story, the full picture? Like how Abby was saying, like, are you taking the time to talk with, everyone that you can throughout a story's process, or even when you're not working on a story, to get, an array of outlooks, an array of opinions that, opinions that of course may not confirm your own biases or beliefs. So I think looking at it that way, instead of focusing inherently on, is this piece objective? Like, I just think that you know, that kind of, you know, pigeonholes the whole thing. It doesn't, you know, create this environment into where you can dig deeper into a story.
Thank you to our fantastic panelists. And I'm going to begin to wrap this up with just a few sets of thanks. Cole, thank you so much for guiding us through the questions. To our panelists, we really appreciate your thoughtfulness and your time. To Professor Quigley, thank you so much for allowing us to join your class. To Professor McElroy, we really appreciate your support of the program. To everyone at the Annette Strauss Institute and the Moody College who moved mountains to make this happen. I believe we have some of our advisory board members who are here as guests. Thank you so much for coming and for your support. And then, of course, we thank Dr. Waffer, we thank Mr. Waffer Denius and the Kane Foundation for your incredible generosity. Perhaps one round of applause for the panelists, and then we wish you a wonderful day. Thank you so much.